Welcome to Business Owner Bootcamp, the WellSpire Advisors podcast designed to help business owners and entrepreneurs take control of their finances. Hosts and financial advisors Michael Delgass and Sandy Wiggins break down key topics like tax strategies, exit planning, business valuations, and real-world experiences with expert guests. And now, here are your hosts, Michael Delgass and Sandy Wiggins.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Delgass, and I'm a co-host of WellSpire's Business Owners Bootcamp podcast. We have quite a few episodes under our belt now, and I hope you will continue to join us for future episodes where we will discuss working with investment bankers on purchases to take out non-operating family members, that is, diffusing family disputes, which is always important, and creating family offices after the sale of a family business. But today, we're going to talk about buy-sell agreements. Before we get started on that, let me introduce myself a little bit more for those of you who don't know me. I'm an advisor at WellSpire, working with clients across the country with a special focus on families that own closely held businesses. I'm joined today by Ben Kronish. Ben is a private client director at Financial Architects Partners, where he specializes in providing tax-efficient life insurance-based solutions to high net worth individuals. Ben is going to talk to us today about buy-sell agreements and about how to best fund those agreements with insurance. But before he does, Ben, can you tell us more about your practice at Financial Architects? What do you do day to day?
Sure, Mike. Well, I think on a day-to-day basis, like a lot of us, I wind up getting involved in a whole multitude of situations involving both sometimes simple, sometimes complicated situations. But for the most part, I try and stay in my lane, which is using life insurance solutions, whether they be for estate planning purposes or business continuity planning purposes, or as in the course of this conversation, discussing how insurance products specifically impact on buy-sell agreements, whether that be between two business owners or a multitude of business owners. Our firm at Financial Architects is agnostic when it comes to insurance product. So when we're looking for solutions to given situations, we're not hindered by having to stay within the guide rails of a company's offerings. We go to the industry and we look to see where we can get the best rates and terms for what the client is looking for.
So let's go to the very beginning. When I used to do this as an attorney for family businesses, I always thought that buy-sell agreements were something you absolutely needed. It was kind of one of the first documents for a business. But why is that? If you agree with me, but why is a buy-sell agreement such a crucial document for closely held businesses?
Well, I think you're right, Mike. I think that most closely held businesses look at a buy-sell agreement as part of their basic business document portfolio. The issue is whether they recognize the importance of funding that buy-sell agreement. The ability for a business to continue in the event of a business owner dying or retiring or becoming disabled is something that, is not obviously a topic that people like to think about. But hopefully when the time comes that they're actually sitting down and creating a business entity, they recognize that they have to look beyond the day-to-day operations of the business and start to plan for what happens if something unexpected were to occur. It's actually kind of funny that we're talking about this today. My wife and I were actually watching a show on Netflix the other night. Some of your listeners might know it is called I think it's called Call Saul or
Better Call Saul. Yeah,
Better Call Saul.
Yeah.
And there's a central theme in the whole show about, I guess it's his brother, who is a attorney at a law firm, who he lives secluded and you can't go into his home with any electrical appliance.
Yeah.
But he keeps saying, I'm going to get better, because he wants to go back to work. And the law firm keeps saying, we want to give this guy money to go away. And my wife and I were talking about it the other night, and I said, if they had a buy-sell agreement in place funded with disability insurance, the disability carrier would dictate whether he was disabled or not. And if they said we're paying the claim, he's disabled and he's getting paid and bought out. So it does apply even in the movie world, it applies.
Yeah, yeah, no, there are probably a lot of examples like that. I think there are a lot of good examples from Succession, other things like that about
Sure.
how closely held businesses can get into trouble. But look, I mean, I get it. Nobody wants to believe that they're mortal, but if you think it would be an incredible disaster for you to die early, just think of what it would be like for everybody else if you died early and had no plan at all for how your business was going to get wound up or go on or, do something with it to try to preserve some value. So yeah, I think those are really great important points. Um, Look, I talked about death, that fun topic. But you mentioned a few other triggers for a buy-sell agreement. I mean, we should talk about a triggering event and what that is. Um, Maybe I should ask you that first. When we talk about what a triggering event is in a buy-sell agreement, what does that mean?
Well, it means the event that would actually cause the buy-sell provisions to be enacted. Um, Obviously, somebody passing away is a pretty clear-cut demarcation that they're no longer involved. But there are certainly others, and I just briefly mentioned on that show how a disability is one of them.
Right.
Retirement is another, and one that people often, don't think about, even though it happens quite commonly, is in the event of a divorce of a business owner. The divorcing spouse might certainly lay claims to part of the business if the business was funded originally with joint assets. And so those kinds of eventualities have to be thought through and at least considered as part of the business's strategy to make sure that they've taken into account and tried to protect themselves as much as they can from something unforeseen happening.
So it sounds like you think that divorce is something that people don't often think about. What are the things that are most overlooked as triggering events?
In my world, in which I actually look at policies and see how people fund these agreements, the disability structure is probably the one most of all that
Hmm.
businesses kind of gloss over when it comes to thinking about what do we need to fund. Um, More often than not, in the actual business agreement, disability is brought up as an event in which a owner could be potentially bought out from the business. But most, from the standpoint of insuring against that, it's probably the most underutilized form of insurance in the buy-sell world. Um,
Hmm.
and why that is, I couldn't really say. I don't know that there's any study been done as to, why isn't it funded? My guess is um, it's because, typically when businesses are thinking about this type of stuff, it's often at the early stages of the business that they draft these documents. Cash flow is probably strapped, and the idea of sort of covering everything may be a little more than they're willing to chew. And so it just seems like the disability component gets put off and then often forgotten.
Well, look, when I started practicing in this area 30 years ago, it was awfully hard to find a disability policy that paid a lump sum.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe that's part of it too, is that there just weren't the mechanisms to allow the the purchase part of the buy sell very easily upon disability. But I take your point, it's important.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that, Mike. And, from a product availability standpoint, the world of disability insurance in general has shrunken. The carriers that are in that marketplace have diminished. And obviously, when there's less carriers and less product available, it may not be talked about quite as much, or it may not be on the central screen for people. But I think that it's the responsibility of the insurance professional who's working with a business owner to at least bring it up because if you look statistically, we all talk about the fact that disability is actually a greater statistical reality than a
Right.
death prior to age 65. So it's something that should at least be contemplated.
Yeah, no, for sure. Um, okay, let's make sure we're covering all the bases and really that people understand the different possibilities around the way a buy-sell agreement is structured. So let's talk about cross-purchase and redemption
Yep.
agreements, how those look and what the difference is, because this is one of those cases where it actually matters how many angels are dancing on the pin or something. The
Yeah.
structure here does matter a lot. So
Yeah.
let's make sure we're all getting that right.
Well, I think you're right. And, I try and approach things from a standpoint of building layer on layer so that people can understand it from the outset. And then you just simply build up to the layers at which it can become a little more complex. So when I talk to people about this, if you've got a two-person business or even a three-person business, um, I don't want to get into tax work. That's your expertise. But if owner A owns insurance on owner B and owner A were to die and owner B now redeems the shares from owner A because they got the insurance proceeds and used that to buy their interest in the business, from a tax perspective, they get a step up in basis because they now have bought owner A's shares in the business. And if they in the future sell the business, they've increased their basis by virtue of that uh, basis that they've acquired.
Right, just
It's
like anything, right? I mean, if I bought a business for $10, I've got a basis in that business for, of $10, right? And if I got insurance to help me buy that business, it's still $10 because that's what I
right,
paid for that business.
right,
So B in your example is the buyer, B for buyer, right? So the buyer got some money, the buyer bought from A or A's estate, and therefore they got basis for whatever that purchase price was.
correct. And when you've got two people who are the owners, it's very straightforward because it only involves
Right.
two insurance policies, and A owns the policy on B, B owns the policy on A, and it's very straightforward. Where it tends to get a little bit more complicated is when you've got multiple owners in a business. And from an insurance perspective, you could wind up with an unwieldy number of policies.
Hmm.
If you've got 5 or 10 owners in a business, um, I'm not good enough at the math to figure out what the multiples are of how many policies you would need. But suffice to say, if you've got 10 owners, it's not 10 policies. It's probably, I don't know, 10 times 9 times, I don't know, a
It's
lot
a
of policies.
combinatorial, right? I mean, you got
And-
to think back to your high school math and factorials and combinatorials and all
right.
that stuff. But we don't want to do that. So we want to make
No,
it
no, we
simple.
don't want to do that. And many
Yeah,
and many businesses don't want to do that. Uh,
right.
and so what their default may often be is, rather than having all these individual policies floating around, is have the company buy the insurance, and the company will redeem the shares of the deceased. So if you've got 10 owners, you've got 10 policies and they're owned by the company. And when any owner would have passed, that policy would get paid to the business. The business would redeem their shares. The issue now is, from a tax perspective, the remaining 9 shareholders don't get a step up in their basis in the business because they did not redeem the shares of the deceased. And so in the future, were that business to be sold, they haven't accomplished a step up in basis that they might have had they bought the deceased shareholders' um, uh, ownership rights in the business. And there's a simple way around that. Again, I don't want to play lawyer or attorney or tax person, but you can set up a partnership or a trust to own the insurance and thereby still maintain the step up in basis because the business itself isn't buying it. So there are ways around, but I think back to your original question, Mike, and I think when most people are thinking about a buy-sell agreement,
Hmm.
they simply need to understand that both scenarios will work. It's simply a matter of which is the situation that puts the surviving business in a better position so that the surviving business owners have as much opportunity to gain as much when they sell the business with as little tax ramification as possible.
Right, right. I mean, you honestly hardly ever see redemptions anymore. Redemptions, buy-sell agreements, it's almost always a cross purchase. I think more or less people have agreed that that's better, but like you said, there are some complexities you got to figure out. Um, your example of using a partnership works really well a lot of times because you get a lot of other good tax benefits as a result, which we don't have to get into right away on that, but that that works well. So, okay, we got some of the basics of buy-sell agreements out there. We've got our cross purchase, maybe with a partnership associated with it. We've got our redemption. You don't see that quite as much anymore, but still something that we should recognize and know about. Let's break down the buy-sell agreement itself, and in particular, why we're doing it in the first place. Because we kind of waved our arms a little bit and said, "Wow, this is really important." But what happens if you don't have one? What are the downsides here we're looking at?
Well, I think the downsides of not having a buy-sell agreement and for that matter, not having it funded are that you leave the business in a precarious position as to how are you going to manage going forward. And I like to often talk to people about this in real world examples. So if we have a business, and again, to keep things simple, we'll talk about a two-person business, and one of the individuals who's an owner were to pass away. Without any kind of a buy-sell agreement, or even if they have a buy-sell agreement without one that's funded. But let's first say no buy-sell agreement whatsoever.
Right,
Um, you would assume that without a buy-sell agreement, the family of the deceased individual is going to be looking at the business and saying, well, that's where our income derived from. And just because our participant in the business is no longer here, that doesn't mean that we give up our rights to the business. So you can now essentially be inheriting partners, whether that be the surviving husband or wife, that now want an equal say in the business because
right,
they've inherited the business from the deceased. Um, I don't think anybody who runs a business would necessarily want to have a partnership based off of that, because the expertise of the person coming in they may know nothing about the business, but yet they've got a legal right now to be part of it. So from a very basic perspective, having an agreement that says in the event that somebody dies, becomes disabled, or were to retire, that the business has the ability to continue to run itself as a profitable entity without interference from someone. The buy-sell agreement almost sets up those parameters. The issue of whether it's funded or not becomes important because assuming that the buy-sell agreement calls for the business to be purchased in the event of a death or a disability or a retirement, funding the agreement creates the asset flow for the business to do that. And again, I'll use the example, if there's a buy-sell agreement written and it calls for the partners to buy each other out in the event of a death, and there is no funding to that, imagine the survivors of the deceased coming to the business and saying, well, according to your buy-sell agreement, you owe us $5 million for the value of the business. It's a $10 million business. The existing business has to make some important decisions. How are they going to pay that? Do they have the cash flow to pay that? Do they need to go to a bank to take out a loan and then
right,
incur additional costs? If they go to a bank to take out the loan, and the business owner who's left is the only one who's really the rainmaker and now has to solely be responsible for creating the future income of the business, that creates tremendous stresses, and it could create a scenario where the business fails. And if the business were to fail, then where is the family that's looking for the income going to go to get their income? Now we're in a court situation. So it's, you can go down this road and peel back the layers of the onion in a lot of different ways. I don't ever like to think of life insurance as the sole answer to every problem. But in this particular situation, having life insurance as the cash source to fund the terms of the buy-sell agreement just makes all the sense in the world. It keeps things simple. It allows the business to focus on running the business and not have the business distracted by saying, now we've got not just our business to run, but we've got a surviving family that we have to take care of and make sure that, that they have the wherewithal that they were promised through our business.
Right, right. I think those are really important points. I want to emphasize a few things about them, right? I mean, without a buy-sell agreement, um, you're trading somebody that is your partner, the person you went into business with. Maybe they're not perfect, but at least you knew them. Um, for somebody you don't know, somebody who's essentially a stranger, and now you've got all that comes with that, right?
Yep.
Um, you are trading somebody who was potentially participating in the business, somebody who's actively there contributing. Not every partner is like that, obviously, but a lot of times, you will have lost a really key person um, in the business, and you're trading them for somebody who's passive, who has nothing to contribute. And that's not their fault, but they're just not ready to step into the shoes and participate and actively add value to the business, because why would they be? They didn't they didn't come up in the business. It was a shock to them that they got thrust into this too. And so now you're saddled with that also. And then you might be saddled with a millstone around your neck of just, how do I pay to get rid of these problems, right? So I've got at least three problems here because I didn't have a buy-sell agreement and I didn't have funding to make it work.
Yeah, and it goes into, it goes into the point that you raised, which I think is a really important one, is that just because, the business is passed on to a surviving spouse or a family member doesn't mean those people are the choice of the remaining partner as who would be their business partner.
Right,
And it just creates a whole litany of issues that, again, people don't like to think about them. But at the end of the day, if there's a way to avoid all of those issues, it's probably at least worth considering it, rather than leaving it where you're kind of in a figure it out as it goes type of a situation.
right, right. So when we're talking about funding these buy-sell agreements, what kind of insurance are we looking at? How do we do this?
Typically, businesses look to use the least expensive form of insurance because at the end of the day, it provides the same dollars if something were to happen. And term insurance, as probably most listeners know, is the most affordable form of insurance over a limited duration. Most businesses that we deal with, even extremely profitable businesses, will opt for term insurance simply because they look at it as a limited duration issue that they need to be concerned with. And I think that for the most part, that's probably the right decision to make. The issue occurs when you get owners who are older and for whom the term insurance may be reaching its end date, where term has expired from a premium structure and goes
Right,
into a much higher structure. And now you may be in a position where as that individual continues in the business, they've outlived the insurance and they may now be unable to get more insurance. So these are real issues, but the answer to your question is most businesses do use term. I personally advocate that they use term unless they're in a cash flow position where some form of permanent insurance could be used. I think that one of the things that businesses often forget about when it comes to this is that if you use a permanent insurance contract and the business were to dissolve at some point or be sold, that insurance doesn't end with the business. It can be taken over by the partner who's the insured. There's
hmm
no what we call transfer for value issues because it's a policy on someone who is a business owner and it passed between the two of them. But for the most part, term insurance, I would say, is what probably 90% of businesses use for purchasing and funding a buy-sell agreement.
Right. Just to add a little more specifics on the transfer for value, that's one reason you use the partnership is that the transfers between partners are always exempt from that transfer for value problem, which I won't get into because it's super complicated, but just suffice it to say you have a partnership and your partners in the life insurance piece, even if for some reason your business structure doesn't work out the right way to get the exception for transfer for value, you still have it if you're trying to divvy up the insurance and that kind of stuff and you don't have the issues there.
And just back to the term insurance for a second, the term insurance policies can be bought now for as long as a 30-year duration with a locked-in premium structure. So if a business is started when someone's in their early 30s, you're talking about securing the next 30 years with that policy. I don't think there's anything wrong with structuring it that way, and kind of as the business progresses, maybe their cash flow increases and they can start to look at some other options. But term insurance is obviously the easiest and least expensive way to fund that insurance off the bat.
Yeah, now look, I want to take a step back here and just add a little bit to make sure we're on the same page for everybody and give you some context for where I want to go next, right? So we've talked about triggers, right? So what are the things triggering the need, the right to get bought out and the need to come up with the cash to do it, right? Second is the valuation. How do we figure out what this is worth? And so far, and this is the reason I wanted to bring it up now, so far we've been kind of pretending that the insurance equals the value because we've got the insurance, the cash is there, yay, and so now we're going to pay it out. But that may or may not be enough, right? Because the business may have grown. So we've got to figure out how that valuation process is happening. It could be appraisals, and this is beyond the scope of this episode, and we'll talk about this more in future episodes about how you get that valuation and how you decide what that is and everything else. But let's pretend for a second it's an appraisal, right? And so we pick an appraiser, and that person tells us what the fair market value is, and we've got $5 million of life insurance, but the appraiser says it's worth $10 million, the interest that we're going to buy out. So now what do we do? The insurance didn't get bigger just by magic, right, Ben?
No, and unfortunately it doesn't. And again, that's, I think, the role of the insurance professional to make sure that the business owners are aware of the fact that valuations of the business for purposes of the buy sell are an important procedure to follow. What the time frame is in which those are done, whether it's every couple of years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever it may be. But because the nature of the insurance is that the value is based on what it was when you purchased it, you really need to take that into consideration. And if the business has grown in value, but the insurance is what you purchased 5, 10, 15 years ago, you're in that scenario of saying, well, do we need to buy more insurance in order to make sure that the buy sell is adequately funded? Or are they going to look to another resource? And again, it's specific to each business. If the business has been successful enough to be able to build up sufficient cash assets that they don't need to buy the insurance and they can use that to fund it, that's fine. I think the important point is that there has to be some form of a review on the buy-sell agreement by the legal and tax people for the business to make sure that it's keeping track with what the actual valuation of the business is, and that they're not finding themselves in a position where the business is worth significantly more than they've covered, and they haven't done anything to make sure that that's provided for in the event of the triggering instances, the death, the disability, or the retirement, or the divorce for that matter.
Right. And this is where the third aspect of buy-sell agreements may come in, and that's the terms of the purchase. Because it could just be, all right, we got a big check from the life insurance company, here you go, right? And the terms are cash on the barrelhead. But it could also be, well, pay me the life insurance as a kind of down payment, and I'm going to let you finance the rest of it. with cash flow from the business or with borrowing from a bank or however you can manage to do it. And that might be fine, but to your point, Ben, it might not be, right? Because we may have massively underfunded it. The down payment may not be anywhere near what we thought it was going to be compared to how great we've grown the business. And now instead of a 20% down, we have 2% down. And now
Yeah, I
we've
mean,
got to finance 98% of it, and that can be tough.
look, it's really no different, and I've never used the analogy, but I think that a buy-sell agreement is actually very similar in some respects to, a will that a person has in their own personal financial affairs. Is that, you can't just set it and forget it. Your life changes, your business changes. You need to make sure that the document that was put in place is still adequate. If you don't have the ability to buy more insurance on a partner and the business has gone up in value, then you plan for it. You either set aside some form of a sinking fund, or you talk about how are we going to pay it out to the surviving family. Maybe we adjust the agreement from being a lump sum payment to being where, yeah, we have 5 million of insurance in place on you, and your side of the business is worth 10. Let's rewrite the agreement so that it doesn't all have to be paid in a lump sum. We'll down pay, as you said, with the 5 million. Hopefully that still represents 50% of the value of the business, and
Right.
we'll fund it over the balance of the 5 years. I think the point is to simply be aware of what the numbers are and what the opportunities are to satisfy those numbers, and not simply wind up where at the very moment when the rug's been pulled out from under the business by one of these events occurring, that now they're all of a sudden sitting there and trying to figure out, how do we do this? And we all face this in the planning community. The most difficult job we have is getting people to take action before action is necessary.
Right. Right.
And we can tell a million stories, but at the end of the day, that doesn't always motivate people. It's really up to us in order to describe it in a way that hopefully resonates with people, but people are going to make the decisions they make, and I think our responsibility is to give them the tools, and hopefully they recognize they're out there and they can use them effectively.
Yeah, yeah, we can describe a fire, but it doesn't feel as hot until
It's
it's
not as
burning
hot.
underneath you. Yeah, yeah. Um, so look, death is obvious here as a trigger. The life insurance connection there is obvious. Maybe disability is less obvious, but like you said, it's kind of statistically more common. It's a more probable kind of problem. So what do we need to know about that?
Yeah, and I'm glad you're asking about this, Mike, because I've actually had two situations in my, uh, I'm going to say it's a 40 plus year career in the business. Um,
Okay.
I've had two situations where a business was impacted by a partner who became disabled. One of them actually occurred on a skiing trip in Stowe, Vermont, and both families were
Well,
together. It was a two-owner business. Both of them were together skiing, and one of the partners, who considered himself to be a very good skier and was, unfortunately, um, hit a tree and wound up becoming paralyzed. And mentally, he was fine, but physically, he was not. And a significant portion of his responsibilities as a business owner was going out in the field and meeting with customers and attracting new business. And he very much so wanted to remain part of the business. His friend, who he was skiing with, um, realized after a short period of time that that wasn't going to work, that they needed to find somebody else to fill that role.
mhm.
And he came to me and said, what do we do now? Is there anything that we can do with the existing insurance that we have? And unfortunately, they did not purchase disability buyout insurance. And so it wound up where they ultimately had to go to court, and the court had to make a determination as to whether the business owner, who was now incapacitated, was able to participate in the business to the point where he could remain a viable partner. And it dragged on for almost 4 years before a decision was made by the court that he was not a viable partner and couldn't participate. But during that 4 year period, he remained an equity partner in the business. He remained getting paid by the business. And it was obviously on a personal level, it was horrible to watch this. I can't imagine what it was like
Yeah.
to be one of those two owners. But to your point, the way a disability buyout policy works is that you've essentially taken an incidence that is, in some respects, determined not so much based on facts like a death is, that someone's no longer here, but by circumstances, which is, can someone continue to perform the duties that are required for their occupation? And the disability policy becomes the judge and jury on that, because if a claim is filed with the insurance company and they deem that that individual is not physically able to continue their position, then the disability insurance company is going to pay the claim. And
I,
that will
I,
then,
I guess I gotta say though that as a lawyer, that's true so long as the lawyer does a good job of tying those two things together. Because it doesn't have to be that way. The trigger needs to be directly tied into the determination of the insurance company, right, to make
yeah,
that
I
work.
mean, for sure. And I think that comes down to how that buy-sell agreement was drafted.
Exactly, yeah.
Because think about it from the perspective of the lawyer drafting the buy-sell agreement. He's not a disability insurance company lawyer. He's a tax lawyer, or he's doing this from a very broad scope. And what he may put in as a disability, he may not even have a definition of disability. He may just simply say, in the event of a disability. Well, what does a
Hmm.
disability mean? Who
Yeah,
says I'm disabled? Well, if you have a funding mechanism, which is an insurance contract, the insurance company determines if you're disabled. And that's a lot cleaner than going to court and having a judge determine if you're disabled.
yeah,
So the disability buyout from a disability company perspective, or a disability insurance policy perspective rather, operates in much the same way as a life insurance policy does, in that it will typically be structured where it pays a lump sum. Sometimes they're structured where the payout is made over a year period, but typically it's in a lump sum. And then that money is paid so that the business can go and buy the shares of the disabled partner and essentially allow the existing business to continue. And in the particular case that we were talking about, with these partners who didn't have that disability insurance in place, the business almost went under because they were continuing to have to pay the partner who was no longer participating. At the same
hmm,
time, they had to go out and find somebody who could fill that role, and they were really cash strapped. So it's 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 something that almost every buy-sell agreement will have language in it about disability, but it won't define it. It won't attempt to set the parameters under which a disability actually occurs. It'll simply mention the word. In the event of a disability, we will buy out the partner.
hmm.
Obviously, there's more to it than what I've just said, but the policy itself becomes a crucial piece of that. And in some respects, I would almost argue it's not more valuable than a life insurance policy. It's just more valuable from the perspective of, it takes any questions off the table. When someone's gone, they're gone. You know that. But when someone can't work, that becomes a matter of determination. And the individual who's not working, more likely than not, doesn't want to let go of that business, because at that point in time, it may be all they have left that's continuing to provide them with a source of income, and
Right.
they're going to want to hold on to it.
I mean, it strikes me that you could solve that problem just by requiring every partner to have their own disability policy. And you could just agree, hey, if one of us gets disabled, we're not going to be able to participate, but we'll get paid through our own disability policy as opposed to getting bought out. I mean, the, there are other possibilities here where two business partners could agree on different structures if they both want it that way and they're both kind of assessing the
Yeah,
risks the same way.
I've never seen that, Mike, but you make a great point. I guess the only counter argument that I would have to that is that individual disability policies typically have limitations as to the amounts of benefits that you're entitled to, and they're typically based on your reported income that you show as to how much disability coverage you can get. And it doesn't in any way take into account the value of the actual business that you own. Many business owners will plow their earnings right back into the business to keep it growing. Well, if they're doing that, they're not able to buy disability insurance that's representative of that, because all they can buy it based off of is what they show on their tax return as their income. So it's certainly better than nothing. And I think that if partners in a business agree that that's what we're going to do, then at least there's a source of income for sure.
Right. Fair enough. Um, so we mentioned a couple other triggers. Let's not forget those. We talked about death and disability. What about divorce and retirement?
Yeah.
Um, I is there divorce insurance?
No, there's not. There's no divorce agreement. And that's one that often the business has to take on to itself, because of the fact that there is no ability to pre-insure against a divorce. But the language for a divorce and the ability to essentially um, not have to take on the partner who might be the divorced spouse is something that doesn't necessarily require immediate funding. It can simply be the language that they've used in the buy-sell agreement, that in the event of a divorce, the ownership of the business that partner A has is entirely their ownership and doesn't transfer to the spouse who's now been divorced, so that they don't have a
Right.
claim to the business.
Right. And this is where buy-sell agreements can get broader than just buying and selling, right? You could have provisions that said that a creditor, like a divorcing spouse, doesn't get voting rights. They don't get to participate as a real partner. They're not admitted under the kind of technical legal world language. They're not admitted to the partnership. They just kind of sit there with their hand out. And if there's a distribution, they get some, but they don't really get to do anything other than that. So you can fix it that way, kind of. It's not a perfect fix. You could have a call right. So I can call away as the kind of existing partner. I could call away the divorced spouse's shares, and I could pay that spouse some dollar amount that maybe is not a big dollar amount because I've set that valuation in a different way for that kind of call right. So there are a lot of options here, but this is where you have to get a little creative and make sure that you're kind of filling the gaps with the document that you can't fill with money or with insurance or some other easier to manage kind of thing.
And
Um,
you make a great point, and it's also part of it ties in a way to the whole issue of the retirement picture,
mhm.
because typically the business is not going to have um, a lump sum of cash to pay to someone upon retirement. However, during the course of the business's years, there could be some form of a sinking fund set up. There could be other purchase arrangements that are made, and a retirement is probably not as acrimonious of a situation as it would be in the event of a disability or, for that matter, even a death if there was no insurance for it. Because if you can imagine the surviving family, if they're told there's no way to fund this agreement that we had between each other, that's not going to be a happy conversation. Whereas at least in a retirement picture, the partner is still here, understands the workings of the business, and hopefully in a well drafted document, you've been able to take into account how we're going to manage that payout for the retiree.
Yeah, it is often hard in my experience if you're talking about relatively young folks starting a business to get them to talk about retirement and kind of
100%.
agree on a mechanism there. But the good news is that you can do it later, right? I mean, you
Right, you've
can
got
kick
years
that
and
can.
years. You've got
Yeah,
years and years to plan for that. And
yeah.
that kind of circles back to why I think we both acknowledge that for the startup business, with all these things ahead of them in the future, both from a good and bad, that they've got to focus on making that business successful. That's why they started it. That's why they're involved in it. And our job, at least my job from an insurance perspective, is to be a sideline player, not the mainline player. I simply want to be there to make sure that we've created a safety net, hopefully a good safety net, but some kind of a safety net. So that if something happens that we hadn't necessarily planned on or not planned on, something happens that we didn't want to think about, that we have a mechanism for that business to continue and for that partner who's no longer there or is there but isn't able to continue in the business to be properly and fairly handled so that nobody walks away feeling like, this situation wasn't an equitable one. And with all the years ahead of them, yes, you have time to do things. And as we all know, the biggest problem with that is, once you get involved, getting people back to the table to talk about these things again is not
Right.
always easy. But
They don't remember how much fun it was in the first place, and they're not looking forward to doing it all over again
right.
frequently.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. But that's where we come into play and our relationships become so important because we can't be perceived as someone who's simply there with our agenda. Our agenda has to be their agenda. And sometimes it takes a little coaching to get them to recognize that there are some things that time dictates now you must talk about. But I really do believe that the most important role that I can play as an insurance professional with the business owner is to simply be a resource and to make sure that they understand how these products and services can work for them. And if I've done a good job in explaining to them how these things work, hopefully they'll make the decision that they're most comfortable with. It doesn't always mean they're going to fund it, but they're going to understand how it works and they can at least make an educated decision. And I think that's really all we can ask for.
I think that's a great place to leave it and a good takeaway for people. And I guess I'll just say to add to that, review your plan and review it often. Remember, remind yourself what it says and make sure it still makes sense.
Yeah, think I often leave business owners when we have this conversation with the conversation by saying that if it's your family that's the one that's impacted, how do you want this to go? Don't think about it in sort of anonymous terms. We're talking here about what the planning is so that your family is taken care of in the event of a death to you, in the event you became disabled. Obviously, retirement is not quite as difficult a hurdle to get over because you're still here. But it really is. The buy-sell agreement is for the benefit of not just the surviving business, but the family of the individual who's been impacted. And maybe when people think about it from that perspective, they're a little bit more willing to look at it with, through clear glasses.
No, I think that's a great point. So, Ben, I want to thank you. Ben Kronish of Financial Architects, thank you very much for joining us in this episode of the Business Owner Bootcamp podcast. We've covered a lot of ground about buy-sell agreements. If you'd like to learn more about that or anything else having to do with closely held businesses, please feel free to reach out to me or anyone at Wellspire. We're here to help guide your journey and connect you with experts like Ben. Whether you're a business owner or an advisor to business owners, this podcast is your go-to for understanding the personal and professional transitions of entrepreneurship. Past episodes have explored topics like qualified small business stock, employee stock option plans, and when to engage an investment banker. You can find us on our website, our YouTube channel, or anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. Just search for Business Owner Bootcamp podcast and hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Business Owner Bootcamp podcast.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Business Owner Bootcamp, presented by Wellspire Advisors. If you have any feedback or questions, including suggestions for future topics and guests, reach out to your hosts or send us an email at clientrelations@wellspire.com.